old buddy Greg Palast. He's the investigative journalist, filmmaker, author. His most recent film project, Long Knife, Osage Oil and the New Trail of Tears. GregPalast.com, of course, his website, Greg_Palast on Twitter. And he's got this new piece that he just pushed out to his email list, and you need to get on his list over at GregPalast.com. It's titled, Trump's Plan to Enforce Amnesia by Law. Greg, welcome back to the program. Tell me about Executive Order 13950 that Donald Trump issued in his last months in office.
Well, just before he was fired by the American people, Donald Trump issued this executive order, which said, and I quote, "You can't teach history in American schools or universities even if, quote, any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex." Now, what is this about? They call this divisive concept law, which says that if you teach the real history of America, and any individual, remember, any individual, they could be a parent, they could be a student, they could be someone walking by the school and overhearing you. Any single individual can shut down that class, can get that teacher fired, and the school district punished. But on Inauguration Day, before it went into effect, Joe Biden rescinded the executive order. Unfortunately, 17 states have now passed that same law, or even harsher versions of it, starting in Georgia. Like every other disease from vote suppression to history suppression comes out of Georgia. It first came out of Georgia, where a history teacher, Matt Hawk, was fired for teaching critical race theory. And he said, you know what? I didn't even know what critical race theory was. So if someone's feeling uncomfortable, and then in Georgia, why did Brian Kemp, the governor, why was he in such a rush to pass this order saying you can't talk about history, especially racial history? And they were very specific about racial histories in Georgia. What is the history they want to protect? In Georgia, the governor, the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, it was his family, they were then called the Habershams, were the very first family, the very first people to bring Africans in chains, to bring in, that they introduced slavery into Georgia, which, by the way, until they did that just before the American Revolution, slavery was actually outlawed in Georgia. It was outlawed, but the Kemp's family got a special dispensation from King George to bring in slaves.
Wow.
They don't want to teach. So why doesn't Brian Kemp want to teach the history of slavery in Georgia?
Governor Brian Kemp. Yeah.
I wonder. And by the way, another bit of history that they don't like to teach is that there is a paragraph, the longest paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote it at the Habersham's house. He was looking at their enslavement system, and he wrote a long screed against slavery. And he said that's one of the reasons why we have to be independent of England, because they forced these slavery on us. I know that's that there's somewhat rich of Thomas Jefferson to write about the horrors of slavery.
Right.
But the Continental Congress actually removed that paragraph. It's the only paragraph that was ever removed from the Declaration of Independence.
Yep.
But they don't want to teach this history. And I have to tell you let me add something to this. Janie Bance is the cousin of Governor Kemp. And she says, why can't we just admit that our family's millions came from whipping people and selling them? The biggest slave auction in American history, over 400 enslaved people were separated from their kids and their husbands and wives, and that was called Weeping Time, and that was done by Brian Kemp's family. Now, I'm not saying Brian Kemp did this.
Sure.
But
and
why
by the way,
not make it real?
You didn't just quote J.D. Vance. You were quoting somebody that sounds like that.
Janie Bance, who is Brian Kemp's cousin, who said we should admit that we made our money from slavery. Yeah, I know it sounds like J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
I don't want to. Let's not confuse them. And so it's taken up now. 27 states have passed these laws, including Oklahoma, which, of course, it looks like my film is banned before it even gets taken out of the can.
Wow. Which raises a question. When's your film going to be ready?
Okay, so we have two films. We're going to have Vigilantes, Vigilantes Inc., Our new film on vote suppression, America's New Vote Suppression Hitmen, will be out on September 6th, and it'll be in general release on the 13th. And then Long Knife, which is the story of the Osage Nation, Coke Oil, and the new killers of the Flower Moon.
Wow.
And I should mention that in Oklahoma, it's not just the history of enslavement in America. It's not just the history of Jim Crow. And again, these laws say that you cannot teach it if any single individual objects, and you can lose your license. In Oklahoma, teacher could lose their teaching license, and their school district could be decertified if they teach, quote, divisive concepts. But they don't say, like in Oklahoma, a lot of the states, like Texas, has a list of over 1,300 books that they've banned. Oklahoma just says, well, it's up to the teacher to guess what a divisive concept is. The result has been that every single copy of the book Killers of the Flower Moon has been removed from the libraries of Oklahoma. That's the story of how the Osage natives were murdered in Oklahoma for their oil wealth.
Right.
And you can't teach that book. Every teacher is taking them out of their libraries. Even the universities are removing them. So you cannot teach the history of Oklahoma in Oklahoma. Wow. And this is happening all over the country. 27 states have laws going through the process now, the legislative process. You already have, like I say, 17 states where a teacher can lose their job. So this is something that people aren't talking about. Well, I will say Kamala Harris talked about it. She spoke on last Thursday to the American Federation of Teachers and say, look, they want to ban books. We want to ban assault rifles. That's your choice here.
Yeah.
So she understands what's going on here. This is, when we talk about, we're talking always about the horse race or sometimes vote suppression, which is an important issue. But we also have to remember what's actually at stake here. And this is what's at stake.
Yeah. Well, and let's dig a little deeper here into motive and outcomes. I get it that Brian Kemp's family, the governor of Georgia, his family, the Republican governor of Georgia, his family were the first to introduce enslaved Africans into the state of Georgia, and he would rather that was not taught as part of the Georgia history curriculum. And I can pretty much guarantee you it never was.
It wasn't. Yeah. We had to really research this and find out. We said, oh my God, it's Kemp's family that brought in
exactly.
And
I told you the story of when Louise and I first moved to Atlanta, and our son was in second grade or third grade, and over dinner I said, what'd you learn in school today? And he says, oh, we're studying the War of Northern Aggression. But yes. So I get why Brian Kemp is a little sensitive about this. But the governor of Oklahoma, he never, his family probably never owned slaves. I mean, what is the end goal here? Why in 27 states have Republicans tried to criminalize, and 12 states succeeded in correct my numbers here, succeeded in criminalizing any instruction about the history of enslavement of African Americans, and I'm assuming also any history about people like Matthew Shepard, the torture and murder of the queer community.
Yes, well, you have to understand, when I was in Georgia, I was literally physically booted out of the Georgia Historical Society because I talked to their expert, Dr. Stan Deaton. And he was going through the history of vote suppression in Georgia, and then he talked about how in the 76, you're going to have to make sure that I have this number right, election, when the Republican candidate lost the popular vote.
Yeah, it was 1876, Tilden versus
1876, and also lost the electoral vote.
Yep.
So they actually pulled off what Trump was trying to pull off.
That's
where
right.
The Republicans cut a deal with the Ku Klux Klan.
Yep.
In the South, which controlled the Democratic Party in the South. So the Klan and the Northern industrialists literally overturned the election by the decision of one man. And he said, look, this is the same situation Mike Pence was in. And as soon as the word Mike Pence came out of his mouth, the door slammed open. And the head of the PR man for the Historical Society said, I had to leave, yanked out the professor, and he literally said to me, we can't have this. We have to, this is a quote, protect our new corporate donors.
Wow.
And the corporate donors are Georgia Pacific, which is part of Koch Industries. They can't cross Charlie Koch. They have Southern Company, a company that I investigated for suspected murder of whistleblowers and massive multi-million-dollar theft from the public.
All right.
Chick-fil-A, you know, the anti-gay stars. I mean,
so are you suggesting, Greg, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're going to hit a hard break here in a minute.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the reason why they don't want the history of enslaved Africans and tortured and murdered gays to be taught is because it might also bring up the issue of how they've suppressed the vote of those same communities?
Suppressed the vote and suppressed your incomes. You know, look, here's the thing is that Donald Trump himself has said that the book he's aiming at stopping from being taught in the schools is Howard Zinn's People's History of America. Then you have to talk about the labor movement. You have to talk about the women's movement. You have to talk about gay liberation.
They don't want any of that stuff taught.
They don't want any of that stuff because then you are actually challenging. When you have the history, you can challenge corporate power in America because you have to know how that power has been used and abused. And believe me, like literally one of their main targets is Howard Zinn's People's History of America. They don't want you to know history. They want to. It's enforced amnesia.
And this, Ron DeSantis passed his infamously his Stop Woke Act. That's another one of these DCL divisive concept laws. Yes,
in fact, let me read you one sentence from it. So his DCL law is really a treat because it literally bans the teaching of advanced placement African American studies. I'm kind of laughing because it's so goofy. It literally says you can't teach this class. Right. And it also says you must teach, are you ready? And this is a quote from the law. Quote, how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. So you didn't realize that enslavement was some kind of like jobs training program.
Yeah, no, I got it. I remember when that happened, and this is grim stuff. You can learn all about it over at gregpalast.com. Get on Greg's mailing list. This is powerful, powerful stuff. Greg, thanks so much for dropping by today.
You're very welcome, Thom.
It is always great having you on. One of America's great investigative reporters. The great Greg Palast. GregPalast.com, Greg_Palast on Twitter. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Stay tuned.